You've heard of bridezillas and wedding day disasters, but what happened at the Wentworth Society wedding of the decade rewrote the book on revenge. A young, seemingly orphaned bride was publicly humiliated, accused of grand larceny, and physically thrown out of her own ceremony by her billionaire mother-in-law. The groom stood by and did absolutely nothing, but as the high society guests laughed and popped champagne to celebrate getting rid of the trash, the ground outside the venue literally began to shake. Less than 5 minutes later, 40 black armored royal SUVs surrounded the estate, barricading every single exit. The bride they just tossed like garbage wasn't who they thought she was. Grab a snack because this story is pure unadulterated karma. Clara Sterling never asked for a fairy tale. Growing up in the foster care system in upstate New York, she learned early on that fairy tales were just marketing campaigns designed to sell dresses to little girls who didn't know any better. She was practical, hardworking, and fiercely independent. By the time she was 26, Clara had earned a master's degree in art history and secured a highly coveted position as an art restorer at a prestigious gallery in Manhattan. She spent her days carefully bringing damaged, forgotten masterpieces back to life. She was comfortable in the quiet, dusty corners of history. Then Liam Wentworth walked into her gallery. Liam was the heir to the Wentworth Real Estate Group, a multi-billion-dollar empire that owned half the skyscrapers in Boston and possessed a lineage that dated back to the Mayflower. He was charming, wealthy, and seemingly fascinated by Clara's quiet intensity. Their whirlwind romance felt like a movie. He whisked her away on weekend trips to Aspen, bought her dinner at Michelin-starred restaurants, and looked at her like she was the only woman in the world. For the first time in her life, Clara let her guard down. She allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was worthy of a fairy tale. But every fairy tale has a villain, and Clara's came in the form of Victoria Wentworth, Liam's mother. Victoria was the undisputed queen of East Coast high society. She was a woman who measured a person's worth by their last name, their stock portfolio, and their bloodline. To Victoria, Clara was a parasite. She was a nobody, with no family, no pedigree, and no money, who had somehow sunk her claws into the Wentworth heir. From the moment Liam introduced them at the family's sprawling Newport estate, the psychological warfare began. Victoria was a master of the microaggression. She would casually mention how quaint Clara's tiny apartment was, or loudly ask her friends if Clara's off-the-rack dress was a hand-me-down. During dinner parties, Victoria would seat Clara next to the kitchen doors away from the senators and tech tycoons that frequented their table. "She's just a phase darling," Clara once overheard Victoria telling Liam in the conservatory. "You'll have your fun with the little charity case, and then you'll marry someone appropriate, someone like Eleanor Astor." But Liam proposed anyway. He got down on one knee in Central Park with a flawless 3-carat Harry Winston diamond. Clara said yes, believing that Liam's love was strong enough to shield her from his mother's venom. The wedding was set to take place at the Breakers in Palm Beach, Florida, one of the most exclusive and expensive venues in the country. Victoria had completely taken over the planning, turning the day into a massive networking event for the Wentworth empire. There were to be 400 guests, an imported symphony orchestra, and tens of thousands of dollars worth of white orchids flown in from South America. Clara felt like a prop in her own wedding. She was isolated, overwhelmed, and entirely alone. Her side of the guest list consisted of her college roommate Sarah and a few colleagues from the gallery. But what Liam and Victoria didn't know, what Clara had kept entirely to herself, was that the orphan narrative wasn't entirely true anymore. 6 months prior, Clara had received a letter that changed her life. A private investigator had finally tracked her down. She wasn't just Clara Sterling, the foster kid. She was the biological granddaughter of Arthur Sinclair, a reclusive European billionaire whose family held royal ties and controlled a global shipping syndicate. Her mother, Arthur's rebellious daughter, had run away to America and tragically died when Clara was a baby. Arthur had spent 2 decades searching for her. When they finally met in a quiet suite at the Plaza Hotel, it was a tearful, emotional reunion. The Sinclair family was prepared to announce her return to the world, to shower her with the inheritance and the title she was owed. But Clara had begged her grandfather to wait. She loved Liam. She wanted to be sure that Liam loved her, the art restorer from the foster system, and not the Sinclair heiress. She wanted one pure, real thing before her life changed forever. It was a test of Liam's heart, a test he was about to fail spectacularly. The morning of the wedding was a masterclass in tension. The Florida sun beat down on the manicured lawns of the breakers, reflecting off the crystal blue ocean. Inside the sprawling bridal suite, Clara sat in front of a gilded mirror, her stomach tied in agonizing knots. She wore a custom Vera Wang gown that she had paid for with her own savings, a small act of defiance against Victoria's insistence on buying her a dress. It was a stunning, sleek silk crepe gown that made her look like old Hollywood royalty. Her maid of honor, Sarah, was carefully pinning a delicate veil into Clara's dark hair. "You look breathtaking," Sarah whispered, squeezing Clara's shoulders. "Just breathe. After today, you and Liam are on a plane to the Maldives, and you never have to look at his mother's Botoxed face again." Clara managed a weak smile. "I just want to get through the vows." At 1 p.m., exactly an hour before the ceremony, the heavy mahogany doors of the bridal suite swung open. Victoria Wentworth marched into the room, flanked by 2 massive private security guards, and Eleanor Astor, the wealthy socialite Victoria had always wanted Liam to marry. The air in the room instantly dropped 10 degrees. Victoria wasn't wearing a mother-of-the-groom dress. She was wearing a blinding floor-length white gown. It was a blatant, calculated insult. But it wasn't the dress that made Clara's blood run cold. It was the look of absolute predatory triumph in Victoria's eyes. "We have a serious problem," Victoria announced, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "What's wrong, Mrs. Wentworth?" Clara asked, standing up, the heavy silk of her train pooling around her feet. "The Wentworth Imperial Sapphire," Victoria said coldly. "A family heirloom that has been in our family for 5 generations. I brought it to wear today. It is missing from my suite." Clara frowned, genuine confusion crossing her face. "I am so sorry to hear that. Have the staff checked the safes?" "Oh, we don't need to check the safes," Eleanor Astor sneered, stepping forward. "We know exactly where it is." Victoria snapped her fingers. The 2 security guards immediately stepped past Clara and Sarah, violently unzipping Clara's overnight bags that were resting on the velvet chaise lounge. "Hey, you can't do that!" Sarah shouted, stepping in front of them. One of the guards simply shoved her aside. "What are you doing?" Clara demanded, panic rising in her chest. "Victoria, call them off." "This is my private property. Thieves have no right to privacy." Victoria spat. One of the guards plunged his hand into the side pocket of Clara's worn leather duffel bag. He pulled his hand out, and dangling from his fingers was a breathtaking, massive blue sapphire, surrounded by diamonds on a platinum chain. Clara stopped breathing. The room spun. "No," Clara whispered, stepping back. "No, I've never seen that before in my life. I didn't put that there. You planted it. You put it in my bag." "Save the performance for the police, you little gutter rat," Victoria hissed, stepping uncomfortably close to Clara. "I knew what you were the moment Liam dragged you into my home, a gold-digging, opportunistic leech. You couldn't just settle for my son's bank accounts, could you? You had to steal the family jewels." "Call Liam," Clara pleaded, turning to Sarah. "Sarah, go get Liam." "Liam is already aware," a voice said from the doorway. Clara turned. Liam stood in the doorway wearing his tailored Tom Ford tuxedo. He looked pale, but his jaw was set. He wasn't looking at Clara with love. He was looking at her with disgust. "Liam!" Clara cried, taking a step toward him. "Liam, please, you know me. You know I would never do this. She hates me. She set me up." Liam looked at the sapphire in the security guard's hand, then back at Clara. He didn't rush to hold her. He didn't defend her. He simply crossed his arms. "My mother told me you were seen sneaking out of her hallway earlier this morning." Liam said, his voice flat and robotic. "I didn't want to believe it, but the proof is right here, Clara." "Liam, I was in the lobby getting coffee with Sarah. Ask the barista. Ask anyone. Clara's voice cracked tears, finally spilling over her eyelashes, ruining her meticulously applied makeup. Are you seriously going to believe this? Are you going to let her do this to us? There is no us anymore, Liam said coldly. The wedding is off. If Victoria had simply called the police or canceled the wedding quietly, it would have been devastating. But Victoria didn't just want to stop the marriage. She wanted to destroy Clara. She wanted to make an example of her in front of the most powerful people on the East Coast. Bring her, Victoria commanded the guards. What? No, don't touch me, Clara shrieked as the two massive men grabbed her by the arms, their thick fingers digging bruisingly into her bare skin. Liam, do something, Sarah screamed, trying to pull the guards off Clara, but Eleanor Astor forcefully grabbed Sarah by the hair, yanking her backward into the wall. Liam simply turned his back and walked down the hallway. The guards dragged Clara out of the bridal suite. She stumbled in her heavy gown, her bare feet slipping out of her expensive heels. They dragged her down the grand marble staircase of the breakers, past the shocked hotel staff, and straight toward the main ballroom where the ceremony was being held. Inside the ballroom, 400 of the wealthiest elites in the country sat in gilded chairs. The string quartet was playing a beautiful sweeping rendition of Bach's Cello Suite No. 1. The scent of tens of thousands of white orchids filled the room. Suddenly, the heavy double doors at the back of the chapel were kicked open. The music screeched to a halt. Every single head turned. There was Clara the bride, crying hysterically, her veil torn, being physically held up by two grim-faced security guards. Behind her marched Victoria Wentworth, looking like a conquering general. Gasps echoed through the cavernous room. Senators whispered to their wives. Socialites covered their mouths in perfectly manicured shock. Victoria marched straight down the center aisle, grabbed the microphone off the officiant's podium, and turned to the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, Victoria's voice boomed through the speakers, echoing off the crystal chandeliers. I apologize for the disruption, but there will be no wedding today. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. We welcome this woman, Clara Sterling, into our family with open arms. Victoria lied flawlessly, staring down at Clara with a look of pure evil. We offered her a life she could only dream of. And how did she repay us? By stealing a multi-million-dollar Wentworth heirloom from my private suite on her wedding day. The crowd erupted. The whispers turned into loud, judgmental murmurs. People were pointing. Someone in the second row actually laughed. She is a common thief. Victoria continued, her voice rising in dramatic cadence. A fraud who targeted my son for his wealth. Luckily, our security team intercepted the stolen property before this criminal could make off with it. Clara stopped fighting the guards. The fight completely drained out of her body. She looked out at the sea of faces, people she was supposed to call family. They were staring at her like she was vermin. She looked for Liam. He was standing near the front row, refusing to make eye contact with her. He didn't love her. He never had. He was a weak, pathetic boy who would always cower behind his mother's money. The tears stopped falling. A strange, eerie calm washed over Clara. The heartbreak was instantly replaced by something much colder and much more dangerous. Fine, Clara thought. You want to play the pedigree game? Let's play. Get this trash out of my sight, Victoria ordered the guards. Throw her off the property. If she comes back, have her arrested for trespassing. The guards roughly turned Clara around and dragged her back down the aisle. The walk felt like an eternity. Guests leaned away from her as she passed, as if poverty and theft were contagious diseases. They dragged her through the lobby and out the front doors of the resort. The midday Florida heat hit her instantly. They shoved her hard, sending her crashing to her knees on the harsh, hot cobblestone of the main circular driveway. The delicate silk of her Vera Wang gown tore against the pavement, her knees bleeding onto the white fabric. Stay off the property, sweetheart, one of the guards sneered. The heavy brass-studded oak doors of the breakers slammed shut with a deafening thud. The lock clicked. Clara knelt there on the hot stones for a long moment. She was entirely alone. A few valets standing nearby looked at her with pity, but didn't dare approach. Slowly, Clara stood up. She wiped the dirt from her bleeding knees and brushed the tears from her face. She reached into the hidden pocket of her gown, a small customization she had requested from the tailor, and pulled out her cell phone. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. She scrolled to a saved contact, a number she had promised herself she would never use to solve her own problems. The contact simply read, "Grandfather." She hit send and put the phone to her ear. It rang exactly once before a crisp European voice answered. "Yes, Miss Sinclair." The head of Arthur Sinclair's security detail answered immediately. Clara stared at the heavy wooden doors of the resort, her eyes hardening into chips of ice. "Tell my grandfather the wedding is off," Clara said, her voice completely unrecognizable, vibrating with quiet, lethal authority. "And tell him I need the convoy. Now." "Understood, miss. Your grandfather is already airborne. The local detail is on standby at the Palm Beach airfield. What is your location?" "The Breakers, main entrance," Clara said. "ETA is 4 minutes, Miss Sinclair. Do you require medical "No," Clara said softly, a dark vindictive smile slowly spreading across her face. "But the people inside are going to." She hung up the phone. She didn't walk away. She didn't run and hide in shame. Clara stood barefoot on the cobblestone driveway, the torn train of her dress whipping in the coastal wind, and she waited. Inside, the Wentworths and their elite guests were laughing, celebrating the successful excision of a peasant from their royal bloodline. They were drinking expensive champagne, completely oblivious to the fact that they had just declared war on a family that could buy and sell the Wentworth empire before breakfast. The countdown had begun. The Florida sun was brutal, baking the cobblestones of the Breakers' main driveway. Clara remained kneeling for a few minutes, the sharp stones digging into her ruined knees, allowing the heat to burn away the last remnants of her grief. By the time she stood Clara Sterling, the orphaned art restorer was gone. In her place stood Clara Sinclair. A valet named Winston, a young college student working the weekend shift, nervously took a step toward her with a bottle of water. "Miss, do you need me to call a cab?" he asked, his voice shaking. He had seen the whole brutal expulsion and was visibly horrified. Before Clara could answer, a low, rhythmic vibration began to emanate from the ground. It wasn't the sound of a single engine. It was a collective thunderous rumble that seemed to swallow the crashing sound of the nearby ocean waves. Winston paused, looking down the long palm tree-lined avenue that led from South County Road to the resort's entrance. First came the police escort, 6 Palm Beach County Sheriff's motorcycles, lights, flashing sirens, wailing forcefully, clearing the intersection. But they weren't there to arrest Clara. They were clearing the path for what came next. Rounding the corner in perfect terrifying synchronization was a fleet of heavily armored matte black Mercedes-Benz AMG 63 SUVs. They didn't just drive. They moved like a military strike force. There were 10, then 20, then 30. The massive convoy stretched all the way down the avenue, a seemingly endless mechanical serpent of wealth and power. Interspersed among the G-Wagons were custom-built, bomb-proof Range Rover Sentinels. The valets dropped the keys they were holding. The wealthy guests lounging on the pristine balconies of the resort stood up their mimosas, forgotten, pointing down at the driveway in sheer bewilderment. The lead SUV slammed on its brakes just inches from where Clara stood. The rest of the convoy fanned out with brutal efficiency. Within 45 seconds, 40 SUVs had completely blockaded the massive circular driveway parked across the manicured lawns and sealed off the service exits. Nobody was getting in, and more importantly, absolutely nobody was getting out. The doors of the vehicles opened simultaneously. Over 100 men dressed in immaculate dark suits wearing earpieces and discreetly carrying sidearms stepped out. They were ex-MI6 former GSG-9 operatives and elite private military contractors. They didn't speak. They simply formed an impenetrable wall around Clara. From the center of the formation, a custom elongated Mercedes-Maybach GLS 600 pulled up. The rear door was opened by a man named Klaus Richter, the formidable head of Sinclair Global Security. An older man stepped out into the humid Florida air. He wore a bespoke charcoal gray suit from Savile Row that probably cost more than the average American's mortgage. He leaned slightly on a silver-tipped walking stick, but his posture was rigid, and his pale blue eyes held the kind of cold, calculating power that toppled governments and dictated global markets. This was Arthur Sinclair, the patriarch. He took one look at Clara, at her torn Vera Wang dress, her bare bleeding feet, and the dirt smeared across her face, and the temperature in the driveway seemed to plummet to freezing. "Grandfather," Clara said softly, her voice remarkably steady. Arthur didn't say a word. He crossed the distance between them and pulled her into a fierce, protective embrace. Clara buried her face in his shoulder, inhaling the familiar scent of expensive tobacco and bergamot. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel safe. "I am so sorry, my dear." Arthur whispered, his thick European accent laced with lethal fury. "I should never have let you endure this charade alone. I needed to know," Clara replied, pulling back and looking him in the eye. "Now I do." Arthur turned to Klaus Richter. "Medical." "No," Clara interrupted, holding up a hand. "I don't want a doctor. I want my dignity back." Arthur studied her face, seeing the hardened resolve in her eyes. He smiled a small, dangerous smirk that promised absolute destruction. "Very well." Klaus removed his impeccably tailored suit jacket and draped it over Clara's bare shoulders to cover her torn dress. He then snapped his fingers, and a security operative rushed forward with a pair of soft black velvet loafers, kneeling to carefully slide them onto Clara's bruised feet. Arthur turned his gaze to the massive brass-studded oak doors of the breakers. "Klaus!" Arthur commanded, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Seal the perimeter, cut their external communications, and open those doors." "With pleasure, sir," Klaus replied. Inside the Venetian ballroom, the atmosphere was a mix of awkward tension and elite relief. The string quartet had resumed playing, though they had switched to a slightly more upbeat Vivaldi piece. Waiters in white gloves were circulating with trays of Dom Perignon. Victoria Wentworth stood near the ice sculpture holding court with a group of wealthy socialites, including Eleanor Astor. Victoria was practically glowing with triumph. "It was a close call, honestly," Victoria was saying loudly, ensuring the nearby senators could hear her. "But I always say breeding tells. You can dress a street rat in silk, but they will still eye your silver. Thank God we caught her before she could pawn the sapphire." Eleanor laughed, sipping her champagne. "Liam looks a bit shell-shocked, poor thing, but he'll recover. He just needed a harsh dose of reality." Across the room, Liam stood near the bar. He wasn't celebrating. He was downing his third glass of Macallan 25 neat. He felt sick to his stomach, a gnawing sense of guilt clawing at his chest. But he pushed it down. His mother was right. The evidence was in Clara's bag. He had to protect the family name. At the front of the room, the hotel's general manager, a nervous man named Gregory, approached Victoria. "Mrs. Wentworth, I apologize for the disruption. Shall we begin serving the caviar course, or would you prefer we clear the room?" "Serve the caviar, Gregory." Victoria declared, waving her hand dismissively. "We paid for a party and we're going to have one. Consider it a celebration of a bullet dodged." Suddenly, the crystal chandeliers above them flickered. The soft, ambient lighting in the ballroom surged, then completely shut off, leaving only the natural light filtering through the massive ocean-facing windows. The string quartet stopped playing. The guests murmured in confusion. "Gregory, what is the meaning of this?" Victoria snapped. "Fix the power immediately. Parti." Before Gregory could reach his radio, the heavy double doors of the Venetian ballroom didn't just open, they were violently shoved apart with such force that they slammed against the interior walls, cracking the expensive plaster. The entire room went dead silent. 400 high society guests turned their heads in unison. Framed in the doorway were a dozen heavily armed men in dark suits, their expressions unreadable. They stepped into the ballroom with tactical precision, fanning out and blocking every single exit, including the doors leading to the kitchen and the patio. "What on earth is going on?" a panicked senator shouted from the second row. "Where is the hotel security?" "Hotel security has been relieved of their duties." A booming, authoritative voice echoed through the room. The wall of suited men parted. Arthur Sinclair walked into the room. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of an apex predator. Behind him walked Klaus Richter, and beside Arthur, walking with her head held high, the oversized suit jacket draped over her torn wedding dress, was Clara. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Liam dropped his whiskey glass. It shattered on the marble floor. Victoria's face drained of color, but her arrogant nature quickly overrode her confusion. She marched forward, her heels clicking aggressively on the floor. "How dare you!" Victoria shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at Clara. "I told my guards to throw you off the property. Who are these men I am calling the police?" "The local police commissioner is currently enjoying a highly compensated vacation on my yacht in the Mediterranean. Mrs. Wentworth," Arthur said softly, stopping just 10 feet away from Victoria. "I suggest you save your breath." "Who do you think you are?" Victoria demanded, her voice wavering slightly as she took in the sheer size of the security force surrounding the room. "You are trespassing on a private Wentworth event." Arthur leaned heavily on his silver-tipped cane and let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "You Americans and your events," Arthur said, his voice dripping with aristocratic disdain. "You possess a few buildings in Boston, and you suddenly believe you are royalty. You know nothing of power, Mrs. Wentworth." Liam finally pushed his way through the crowd, stepping in front of his mother. "Clara, what is this?" "Who is this man?" Clara looked at Liam. The man she had loved for 2 years. The man who had stood by and watched her be dragged through the mud. She felt absolutely nothing for him. "This," Clara said, her voice ringing out clearly across the silent ballroom, "is my grandfather." Victoria scoffed loudly, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "Your grandfather, don't be ridiculous. You're a foster child, an orphan, and a thief." Arthur Sinclair's eyes narrowed into terrifying slits. He raised his hand, and Klaus Richter stepped forward, holding a sleek black tablet. Klaus tapped the screen, and the massive projection screens at the front of the ballroom, which were supposed to show a slideshow of Liam and Clara, suddenly flared to life. On the screen was a high-resolution live feed of the global financial news networks. Allow me to introduce myself properly," Arthur said, his voice echoing through the room. "I'm Arthur Sinclair, chairman of the Sinclair Syndicate, Duke of the Sovereign Territory of Vancouver, and this woman you just physically assaulted and threw onto the street like a stray dog is Clara Sinclair, the sole heir to a $400 billion empire." The silence in the room was absolute. It was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the champagne buckets. Eleanor Astor dropped her clutch. The blood vanished from Liam's face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He stared at Clara, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, as his brain tried to compute the catastrophic mistake he had just made. Victoria swayed on her feet. The name Sinclair was legendary, even among the ultra-wealthy. They weren't just rich. They owned the shipping lanes that brought the Wentworths their construction materials. They banked the banks that held the Wentworth loans. They were old-world, untouchable money. "No," Victoria whispered, shaking her head. "No, that's impossible. This is a trick. She stole my sapphire." "She's a criminal." Arthur's smile vanished. "Ah, yes. The sapphire. Let's discuss this. Theft, shall we?" "Nobody leaves this room," Arthur commanded. Several guests, sensing the legal and social disaster unfolding, had begun inching toward the exits. The Sinclair security operatives simply crossed their arms, physically blocking the doors. A prominent tech billionaire tried to push past an operative and was swiftly shoved back into his chair with a warning look. "You can't hold us hostage." Liam finally found his voice, stepping toward Arthur. "This is kidnapping." This is an investigation. Klaus Richter corrected smoothly, stepping between Liam and Arthur. A crime has been reported. A Sinclair has been accused. We are simply expediting the truth. Sit down, Mr. Wentworth, before I make you sit. Liam looked at the massive security chief, then looked at Clara, who was staring at him with cold indifference. Defeated Liam backed away. Now, Arthur said, turning his attention back to a hyperventilating Victoria. You claim my granddaughter stole the Wentworth Imperial Sapphire from your suite, a suite that I presume is heavily monitored. Of course it is. Victoria snapped, trying to project strength. My personal guards were outside the door all morning. The only person seen exiting the hallway was Clara. Interesting, Arthur noted. He gestured to Klaus. Klaus tapped his tablet again. The projection screens in the ballroom shifted from the financial news to black and white security footage. As a matter of protocol, Klaus announced to the room, the Sinclair Syndicate has had an advanced security detail shadowing Miss Clara for the past 3 weeks, for her protection considering the hostile environment she was entering. Victoria flinched. Offrey, our operatives placed localized invisible microcameras in key areas of the venue late last night, Klaus continued, including the hallway outside the bridal suite and the hallway outside Mrs. Wentworth's suite. On the screen, the timestamp read 9:14 a.m. The footage showed Clara walking down the hallway, carrying 2 cups of coffee, heading back toward her bridal suite. She passed the hallway leading to Victoria's room, but she never turned down it. As you can see, Klaus stated, Miss Sinclair was never near your suite. Then who put it in her bag? Liam demanded, looking at his mother in confusion. Klaus fast-forwarded the footage to 10:45 a.m. The camera angle was from inside the bridal suite itself. The room was empty. Clara and Sarah were down in the salon. Suddenly, the door to the bridal suite opened. A young hotel maid pushed her cleaning cart into the room. She looked around nervously, her hands shaking. She reached into her apron, pulled out a heavy platinum necklace with a massive blue stone, and quickly shoved it into the side pocket of Clara's leather duffel bag. The entire ballroom erupted in gasps. It was a setup, Sarah, Clara's maid of honor, shouted from the back of the room, pointing at Victoria. I knew it. You framed her. That proves nothing. Victoria shrieked, her voice shrill with panic. That maid is clearly a thief. She must have stolen it from me and hid it in Clara's bag when she realized she couldn't get it out of the hotel. Is that your final statement, Mrs. Wentworth? Arthur asked, his voice dangerously low. Yes, that is exactly what happened, Victoria insisted. Klaus Richter signaled the men at the back doors. The doors opened and 2 Sinclair operatives walked in, escorting the very same maid from the video. The young woman was sobbing uncontrollably. Maria, Klaus said gently, addressing the maid. Please tell the room what you told our operatives in the kitchen 10 minutes ago. Maria looked terrified, her eyes darting between Victoria and the imposing figure of Arthur Sinclair. She paid me, Maria sobbed, pointing a shaking finger directly at Victoria Wentworth. Mrs. Wentworth paid me $50,000 in cash this morning. She gave me the necklace and told me to put it in the bride's bag. She said if I didn't do it, she would have me fired and deported. Liam stared at his mother, absolute horror washing over his face. Mom, tell me she's lying. Tell me you didn't do this. Victoria was backed against the ice sculpture, looking like a trapped animal. She's a liar. They paid her off. This is all a fabrication. I have the cash in my locker, Maria cried. In the envelopes with the Wentworth Company seals, pay. The room began to turn on Victoria. The elite crowd, always eager to witness a downfall to elevate their own status, began murmuring in disgust. Eleanor Astor subtly took 2 steps away from Victoria, distancing herself from the radioactive social ruin. A pathetic amateur setup, Arthur said, shaking his head. But there is one thing that still bothers me, Mrs. Wentworth. You went to all this trouble to frame my granddaughter for grand larceny. But why use a fake as The murmuring in the room instantly stopped. "What?" Liam asked, stepping forward again. "What do you mean a fake? The Imperial sapphire has been in our family for 100 years. Klaus Richter reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a small velvet evidence bag containing the necklace the guards had pulled from Clara's duffel. He handed it to Arthur. Arthur held the massive blue stone up to the light, inspecting it with an expert eye. "A very good replica, I will admit. Lab-created corundum, set in white gold, not platinum, worth perhaps $2,000. Certainly not a multi-million-dollar heirloom." "That's a lie!" Victoria screamed, lunging forward, but a Sinclair guard stepped in her path. "Give that back. I had my chief gemologist review high-resolution photos of this piece just moments ago." Arthur continued calmly. "It is paste, which begs the question, Liam, where is your family's actual wealth?" Arthur turned his piercing gaze to Liam. "Did you know your father made several catastrophic investments in Dubai real estate 5 years ago? Investments that nearly bankrupted the Wentworth Group." Liam looked completely lost. "No, the company is fine. We just posted record profits. Creative accounting," Arthur corrected. "Your mother has been quietly liquidating family assets for years to keep up appearances and pay off the interest on those bad loans. The yacht, the house in the Hamptons, and apparently the Imperial sapphire, sold to a Russian oligarch 3 years ago." Victoria let out a strangled cry and buried her face in her hands. The secret she had harbored for years, the desperate facade she had maintained to keep her throne in high society, was crumbling to dust in front of her peers. She hadn't just hated Clara because she was poor. She hated Clara because Clara was a reminder that the Wentworths were dangerously close to being poor themselves. Victoria had needed Liam to marry Eleanor Astor to secure an influx of capital to save the company. Clara was in the way. "You framed her," Liam whispered, his voice cracking. He looked at his mother with utter disgust. "You destroyed my wedding. You destroyed my life. For money." Liam turned to Clara, his eyes filled with desperate pleading tears. He took a step toward her, holding his hands out. "Clara? Clara, please. I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know. I love you. We can fix this. We can still get married." Clara looked at the man she had almost tied her life to. She saw him clearly now. He wasn't a victim of his mother's machinations. He was a byproduct of them. He was weak. When she needed him most, he hadn't believed her. He had let her be dragged through the dirt because it was easier than standing up to his mother. Clara stepped out from behind her grandfather. She looked Liam up and down, pulling the oversized suit jacket tighter around her shoulders. "You didn't know the stone was fake, Liam." Clara said, her voice ice cold and echoing in the dead silence of the ballroom. "But you knew me, and you believed I was a thief the second it was convenient for you." "Clara, I was confused." "You're a coward." Clara interrupted, her words slicing through the air like a scalpel. "You let them throw me out like trash. You stood there and watched." She slipped the 3-carat Harry Winston engagement ring off her finger. She didn't hand it to him. She dropped it on the marble floor. It bounced with a sharp, high-pitched clink that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Keep the ring," Clara said softly. "It sounds like you're going to need the money." The sound of the 3-carat diamond ring bouncing against the cold marble floor of the Venetian ballroom seemed to echo for an eternity. For a moment nobody breathed. The string quartet remained frozen bows, hovering uselessly over their instruments. The 400 elite guest people who controlled the stock market and influenced national elections were rendered completely mute, paralyzed by the sheer gravitational pull of the power dynamics shifting violently before their eyes. Liam stared down at the glittering stone resting near the toe of his polished Tom Ford shoe. The realization of what he had lost, not just the multi-billion-dollar Sinclair fortune, but the only woman who had ever loved him for simply being Liam and not for his trust fund, crashed over him like a suffocating wave. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot, his jaw trembling. He opened his mouth to speak, to beg to offer some pathetic platitude of redemption, but the terrifyingly calm voice of Arthur Sinclair cut him off before a single syllable could escape. "Do not insult my granddaughter by speaking to her again." Arthur said, his voice quiet, but carrying the lethal resonance of an incoming artillery shell. "You made your choice, boy. You chose the shelter of your mother's decaying empire over the loyalty of a woman who was infinitely too good for you. Now you will reap the harvest of that cowardice." Arthur turned his attention away from Liam, dismissing him as one would dismiss a mildly annoying insect, and focused his pale glacial eyes back on Victoria. Victoria was hyperventilating, leaning heavily against the ice sculpture, her knuckles white as she gripped the frozen swan to keep her trembling legs from giving out. The meticulously crafted facade she had spent decades building, the illusion of the untouchable Wentworth superiority, was lying in shattered pieces on the floor, destroyed by a weeping hotel maid and a fake sapphire. This is an outrage." Victoria gasped, her voice completely stripped of its usual aristocratic arrogance. It was high-pitched, desperate, and shrill. "You burst into my private event, you make wild, slanderous accusations, you parade a lying servant before my guests. I will sue you, Arthur Sinclair. I will drag your name through the American courts until you are nothing." Arthur actually smiled. It was a terrifying sight. It was the smile of a tiger that had finally cornered a particularly slow deer. "Sue me." Arthur chuckled, leaning slightly on his silver-tipped cane. "Mrs. Wentworth, you cannot afford to hire a traffic lawyer at this precise moment, let alone mount a transatlantic legal campaign against the Sinclair Syndicate." Arthur gestured smoothly to Klaus Richter, who stood like a monolithic statue by his side. Klaus stepped forward and tapped the screen of his tablet. The massive projection screens behind the altar, which had previously shown the humiliating security footage of the framed theft, flickered and changed. The screens now displayed a dense, highly detailed financial ledger. To the untrained eye, it was just a sea of red numbers and complex banking jargon, but to the room full of hedge fund managers, real estate tycoons, and investment bankers, it was a perfectly painted portrait of absolute financial slaughter. "Let us talk about your empire, Victoria." Arthur began his tone almost conversational, as if he were discussing the weather rather than destroying a legacy. "The Wentworth Real Estate Group, a venerable institution, yes, founded in the 1920s, survived the Great Depression. It is a shame it will not survive the afternoon." Victoria's eyes darted frantically to the screens. "Turn those off. Those are private financial records. This is corporate espionage." "This is public record if you know where to look, and I assure you my forensic accountants know exactly where to look," Arthur countered smoothly. 5 years ago, your late husband borrowed heavily against your flagship properties in Boston and New York to finance a disastrous venture in the Middle East. When that venture collapsed, the Wentworth Group was left with $4.2 billion in toxic debt. Whispers erupted like wildfire among the seated guests. Several men in the front row investors who had significant holdings in Wentworth developments suddenly looked physically ill. Cell phones began to subtly appear from suit pockets as guests frantically began texting their brokers under the tables. "To hide this insolvency and maintain your ridiculous lavish lifestyle," Arthur continued mercilessly, "you began engaging in a highly illegal shell game. You took out secondary mortgages using fraudulent valuations. You liquidated the family trusts. You sold off the genuine heirlooms and replaced them with paste. But the debt always comes due, Victoria. The interest alone is bleeding your company dry. You are surviving month to month by the absolute skin of your teeth." "Lies!" Victoria screamed, pointing a shaking finger at Arthur. "We are restructuring. We have secured new capital." Yes." Arthur nodded slowly, his eyes drifting over to Eleanor Astor, who was standing a few feet away, looking absolutely horrified. "The new capital, the highly anticipated merger of the Wentworth and Astor families, a marriage of convenience designed to inject Astor liquid assets into the dying Wentworth corpse. That was the plan, wasn't it? That is why Clara had to be removed. She was standing in the way of your bailout." The entire ballroom turned to stare at Eleanor Astor and her parents, who were seated in the second row. Eleanor, a woman raised to survive in the ruthless jungles of high society, realized instantly that the ship was sinking and she had no intention of going down with it. She stepped forward, her face a mask of cold, calculated distance. "I have no idea what you are talking about, Mr. Sinclair," Eleanor announced loudly, ensuring her voice carried to every corner of the room. She turned to look at Victoria with a mixture of pity and intense disgust. "There is no merger, there is no arrangement, and after witnessing this deplorable criminal behavior today, the Astor family will be severing all personal and professional ties with the Wentworths." Effective immediately, Victoria gasped as if she had been physically struck. "Eleanor, you can't do this. We had an agreement. We had an agreement based on the presumption that you were solvent." "Victoria." Eleanor's father, a formidable banker, shouted from his seat, standing up to join his daughter. "You lied to us. You are a fraud. Please." Victoria begged, the last remnants of her dignity vanishing. She looked out at the sea of her friends, the people she had gossiped with, vacationed with, and ruled over. "Please do not listen to this man. We are Wentworths." But the crowd was already turning away from her. The social execution was absolute. In their world, poverty was the only unforgivable sin, and Victoria had just been exposed as the poorest person in the room. Arthur raised his hand, silencing the growing din of the panicked guests. "But I am not quite finished, Victoria," he said softly. He looked at Klaus Richter. "Klaus, the promissory notes." "Acquired, sir," Klaus replied instantly. "At 8 a.m. this morning, European Standard Time, the Sinclair Syndicate systematically purchased every single outstanding loan mortgage and debt obligation held by the Wentworth Real Estate Group from your various creditors." Liam's head snapped up. "What, you bought our debt?" "I own you," Arthur stated, simply looking directly into Liam's eyes. "Every brick of your buildings, every grain of sand on your beachfront properties, every penny in your frozen bank accounts. I own it all. And as of—" Arthur paused, slowly pulling a gold pocket watch from his waistcoat and checking the time. 5 minutes ago, the Wentworth Real Estate Group officially defaulted on those loans. The grace periods have expired." Victoria collapsed to her knees on the marble floor, her white gown pooling around her. She wasn't acting anymore. The shock had completely broken her. No, please. You can't. My attorneys are currently filing the foreclosure paperwork in federal court in New York, Massachusetts, and Florida." Arthur declared, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "Your corporate offices are currently being locked down by federal marshals. Your personal assets, including this resort venue, have been seized pending a full audit for suspected wire fraud and embezzlement. You have nothing, Victoria. You are less than nothing." Arthur looked down at the weeping, broken woman on the floor. There was no pity in his eyes, only the cold, mechanical justice of a man protecting his blood. "You called my granddaughter a stray dog," Arthur whispered, leaning in so only Victoria, Liam, and Clara could hear his final verdict. "You told her she was a commoner. Look at yourself now, Victoria. You are sitting on the floor begging for mercy from a man who is going to take the very clothes off your back to settle your debts. Welcome to the gutter." The silence in the Venetian ballroom was no longer shocked. It was a graveyard silence. The sheer, overwhelming totality of the destruction Arthur Sinclair had just unleashed was terrifying to behold. He hadn't just ruined a wedding. He had dismantled a dynasty in under 10 minutes. Clara stood beside her grandfather watching the wreckage. She looked at Victoria sobbing incoherently on the floor, her makeup running in dark, ugly streaks down her face. She looked at Liam standing frozen, his mouth open, looking like a little boy who had just watched his house burn to the ground. A few hours ago, Clara would have given anything to have these people accept her. She had twisted herself into knots, trying to be polite, trying to be small, trying to prove she was worthy of their world. Now she realized the profound tragedy of it all. Their world was entirely hollow. It was built on lies, stolen money, and the vicious tearing down of others to maintain an illusion of height. She felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Arthur. "Are you ready to leave this place, Clara?" he asked gently. Clara took a deep breath. She pulled Klaus Richter's oversized suit jacket tighter around her shoulders, covering the torn bodice of her wedding dress. She looked out at the crowd of terrified, silent elites. "Yes," Clara said clearly. "I am." Arthur nodded. He turned to the room one last time. "Klaus, call the local authorities. Inform them we have a signed confession and physical evidence of grand larceny, extortion, and fraud regarding Mrs. Wentworth's little stunt with the maid. Let the police sort through the ashes." "Understood, sir," Klaus said, tapping his earpiece. Arthur offered Clara his arm. She took it, her posture perfect, her chin held high. "Make way!" Klaus barked, his voice echoing through the room. The Sinclair operatives blocking the doors stepped aside. The wealthy guests, desperate to avoid the gaze of the Sinclair patriarch, scrambled out of the center aisle, pressing themselves against the walls and the chairs to give Arthur and Clara as much space as possible. It was a walk of absolute triumph. As they walked down the aisles, Clara didn't look down. She didn't look angry. She looked completely at peace. She passed Eleanor Astor, who quickly averted her eyes. She passed the whispering senators and the panicked hedge fund managers. Just before they reached the doors, a hand reached out and grabbed Clara's elbow. It was Liam. He had run after them. He looked completely shattered, tears streaming freely down his face. "Ah!" "Clara, wait!" Liam choked out his grip on her arm, desperate. "Please, I'm sorry. I was stupid. I was blind. Please don't do this. Don't leave me." Klaus Richter moved so fast it was a blur. In a fraction of a second, Klaus had Liam's wrist locked in a brutal bone-snapping grip, forcing Liam to release Clara and drop to his knees with a sharp cry of pain. "Do not touch her," Klaus warned, his voice a low mechanical growl. Clara looked down at Liam kneeling before her. This was the man who was supposed to protect her, the man who was supposed to stand by her side against the world. "Let him go, Klaus," Clara said softly. Klaus released Liam's wrist and stepped back, though he kept his hand hovering near his sidearm. Liam rubbed his wrist, looking up at Clara with desperate, pleading eyes. "Clara, I can change. We can go away. Just the two of us. We don't need the money. I don't care about the company. I just want you." Clara looked at him, and for the first time that day she smiled. It was a sad, knowing smile. "You do care about the money, Liam," Clara said quietly. "It's all you've ever cared about. You didn't defend me because you thought I was a thief. You didn't defend me because defending me meant losing your inheritance. You chose the money." "No, And the tragic irony," Clara interrupted, her voice gaining strength, "is that if you had just stood by me, if you had just believed in me for 1 second, you would have had more money than your mother could have ever dreamed of." Liam's breath hitched. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. "But you failed the test," Clara whispered. "You are exactly who your mother raised you to be, and now you get to live with her in the ruins." Clara turned her back on him for the final time. She linked her arm through her grandfather's, and together they walked out of the Venetian ballroom, leaving the heavy double doors wide open behind them. The walk through the lobby was surreal. The hotel staff, having heard the commotion, stood in stunned silence as the convoy of suited men escorted the barefoot bride and the European billionaire out the front entrance. The blistering Florida sun hit them as they stepped onto the cobblestone driveway. The 40 black armored SUVs were still in perfect formation, their engines purring menacingly. Klaus opened the rear door of the elongated Maybach. Clara slid into the luxurious, climate-controlled leather interior. Arthur slid in beside her. Klaus closed the door with a solid, heavy thud, sealing them off from the chaos they had left behind. To the airfield, Arthur ordered over the intercom. "Tell the pilot to prep for a transatlantic flight. We're going home to Geneva." "Yes, sir," the driver responded. The convoy began to move. The police escorts fired up their sirens, parting the heavy Palm Beach traffic like a knife through butter. As the Maybach turned onto South County Road, Clara looked out the tinted window. Several squad cars from the Palm Beach Police Department were speeding in the opposite direction, their lights flashing brightly, heading straight for the breakers. They were going to arrest Victoria. Clara let out a long, shaky breath and leaned her head against the cool leather of the seat. The adrenaline was finally beginning to wear off, leaving a deep, profound exhaustion in its wake. Arthur reached over and gently took her hand. "You did brilliantly, my dear. Your mother would have been incredibly proud of your strength today." Clara looked at the old man. She saw the fierce, uncompromising love in his eyes. He had flown across the ocean with a private army just to protect her dignity. "Thank you, grandfather," Clara whispered, "for coming for me." "Always, Clara," Arthur replied, squeezing her hand. "You are a Sinclair. You will never walk alone again." 14 months later, the spring air in Paris was crisp and filled with the scent of blooming jasmine. Inside the Grand Palais, the atmosphere was electric. It was the opening night of the most highly anticipated art exhibition of the decade, a collection of recovered and restored Renaissance masterpieces that had been lost for nearly a century. The gallery was packed with international dignitaries, famous artists, and global philanthropists. They were all there to see the art, but more importantly, they were there to see the woman who had made the exhibition possible. Clara Sinclair stood near a beautifully restored Caravaggio, a crystal flute of champagne in her hand. She was unrecognizable from the terrified, humiliated bride kneeling on the cobblestones in Florida. She wore a custom emerald green haute couture gown that clung perfectly to her frame. Her dark hair was swept up in an elegant modern twist. Around her neck rested a stunning, authentic, flawless diamond choker, a piece from the Sinclair private vault. She radiated quiet, unshakable confidence. Over the past year, Clara had fully embraced her role within the Sinclair syndicate. While she had no interest in the ruthless corporate takeovers her grandfather orchestrated, she had taken absolute control of the Sinclair philanthropic and cultural arms. She commanded an endowment of over $50 billion, using it to fund global art restoration projects, build schools in developing nations, and notably establish a massive scholarship fund for children aging out of the American foster care system. She was powerful, respected, and entirely free. Miss Sinclair, Clara turned. Sarah, her former maid of honor and now the highly paid director of operations for the Sinclair Arts Foundation, was walking toward her with a clipboard. "The French Minister of Culture is asking for a moment of your time," Sarah said, smiling. "He wants to discuss the funding for the Louvre wing expansion." Tell him I will be with him in 5 minutes." "Sarah," Clara said warmly. "Everything looks spectacular tonight. You did an amazing job." "We did an amazing job," Sarah corrected, clinking her glass against Clara's. As Sarah walked away to manage the minister, Clara took a moment to simply breathe in the success of the evening. It was a perfect night. But perfection, she had learned, was rarely entirely uninterrupted. From the corner of her eye, she noticed a commotion near the main entrance. The imposing figures of the Sinclair security detail, still led by the ever-vigilant Klaus Richter, were blocking someone from entering the VIP area. Clara narrowed her eyes and took a few steps closer to the velvet ropes. It was a man. He was wearing a cheap, poorly fitted suit. He looked gaunt, exhausted, and deeply aged. He was arguing frantically with the guards, holding up what looked like a crumpled press pass. Clara's breath caught in her throat for a fraction of a second. It was Liam. The fall of the Wentworth Empire had been spectacularly documented meticulously by the global press. Without the Sinclair bailout, the company had been liquidated. The banks had seized everything. Victoria Wentworth, after a highly publicized and deeply humiliating trial, had been sentenced to 3 years in a minimum security federal facility for extortion and fraud. Liam had been left with absolutely nothing. His name was radioactive. No major firm would hire him. The high society friends who used to drink his champagne now pretended they didn't know him. The last Clara had heard, he was working as a mid-level real estate broker for a no-name agency in New Jersey, living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment. "Let me through, please. I just need to speak to her for 1 minute." Liam was pleading with Klaus. Klaus simply crossed his massive arms. "You do not have the proper credentials for this sector. Step back, or you will be physically removed." Clara watched him struggle. A year ago, the sight of him looking so broken might have elicited a pang of pity. But the fire of that Florida afternoon had burned away any lingering sentimentality. She felt absolutely nothing. He was a stranger. She took a step forward, approaching the velvet rope. Liam saw her. His eyes widened, a mixture of awe and desperate hope flooding his face. He pushed against the rope. "Clara!" Liam called out, his voice cracking. "Clara, please, it's me." Klaus moved to intercept, but Clara held up a single elegant finger. Klaus instantly stopped and stepped back, allowing Clara to approach the rope. Liam looked at her, taking in the haute couture, the diamonds, the sheer aura of untouchable power she projected. He looked down at his own frayed cuffs in shame. "Clara, you look incredible," Liam stammered. "What do you want, Liam?" Clara asked. Her voice wasn't angry. It wasn't cold. It was simply indifferent. Liam swallowed hard. I read about the exhibition. I saw you were in Paris. I had to see you. I wanted to apologize properly for everything. I was weak, Clara. I was so stupid. I think about you every single day. I lost the best thing that ever happened to me." He reached over the velvet rope, offering his hand. "Please, can we just get a coffee? Can we just talk?" Clara looked at his outstretched hand. She didn't move to take it. She remembered kneeling on the burning cobblestones, bleeding and humiliated, while he stood in an air-conditioned room and let his mother throw her away. "Liam," Clara said softly, stepping slightly closer to the rope so only he could hear her. "Do you know what my grandfather taught me over the past year?" Liam shook his head, desperate for any connection. "He taught me that power isn't about the money in your bank account or the name on your building." Clara said, her eyes locking onto his. "Power is the ability to dictate your own reality. Power is deciding who gets to exist in your world." She looked at him with absolute devastating finality. "And you," Clara whispered, "do not exist in mine." Liam physically recoiled as if she had slapped him. The hope drained from his eyes, replaced by the crushing realization that there was no coming back. There was no redemption. The door was permanently, eternally sealed shut. Clara turned to her head of security. "Klaus, he is disturbing the guests. Escort him out of the building and make sure he isn't allowed back inside." "With pleasure, ma'am," Klaus said. Klaus and another operative grabbed Liam firmly by the arms. Liam didn't fight back. He simply slumped his shoulders and let them drag him away from the lights, the champagne, and the woman who now owned the world. Clara didn't watch him go. She turned her back, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her emerald gown. She picked up her crystal flute from a passing waiter and walked gracefully back toward the exhibition floor, stepping into the brilliant, dazzling light of her own making. The queen had claimed her throne, and she would never kneel again. If you thought the Wentworths were going to get away with treating Clara like garbage, you clearly don't know what happens when old European money clashes with arrogant American billionaires. This satisfying story of revenge power and ultimate karma proves that you should never judge a book by its cover or a bride by her bank account. Watching Arthur Sinclair systematically dismantle the Wentworth empire in front of all their elite friends has to be one of the most savage mic drop moments in history. If Clara's epic comeback and the arrival of the Sinclair royal convoy had you cheering at your screen, you know what to do? Smash that like button right now. Don't forget to share this story with someone who loves a good karma comeback, and absolutely subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable jaw-dropping stories of drama and revenge. Ring that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Let us know in the comments below What was the most satisfying moment of Clara's revenge for you? See you in the next video. Next.